action. Thank you so much for coming to day one of the HVG conference. It is an absolute delight to share this digital space with three individuals that are challenging our notions, supporting our sector around inclusion. As we have seen the end of Gender Awareness Week, and that finished very poignantly yesterday with Remembrance Day, I think it's very apt that we've got time and space to reflect on the guidance that we're going to be talking about today. The reason I think highlighting any form of inclusion is important is because whatever we put in place for one group has positive consequences for other groups. It enables us to have a sense of humanity, support, and opportunities to engage. I am not an expert in any of this, so I'm going to hand over to Richard, Suzanne and EJ in terms of the presentation that they're going to go through. And I'm happy to do your slides, but it's entirely up to you. What would you like to do, Richard, Suzanne and EJ?
Well, I can try. EJ's going to open up for us. I'm just going to check if I share my slides.
We can see those. Absolutely.
I can see them forward. Perfect.
Wonderful. And at the end, we'll have time for questions or reflections as well. So I'm going to put myself on mute and hand over to you guys.
Thanks, Tamsin. Thank you for the warm welcome. And good morning, everybody. We're absolutely thrilled to be giving you some insight into the trans-inclusive culture guidance on advancing trans inclusion for museums, galleries, archives, and heritage organisations. You can all download it now for free from the University of Leicester's Research Centre for Museums and Galleries website. I'm EJ, I'm the curator of the Museum of Transology, and I'm joined today with my co-authors of the guidance, Susan McLeod and Richard Sandell, who are also the directors of the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries. So I'm in esteemed company as always. And Tamsin, just want to say that we're completely thrilled to be asked to present today. And I think for a couple of reasons, not least because we are grateful to the Heritage Volunteering Group for engaging with us so early on as we were drafting the guidance, in order that we could really build ways in which we could make it inclusive of volunteers, because they're absolutely a key part of the heritage workforce. We all know that. I certainly know it firsthand. It was my early days of volunteering that sometimes I think taught me everything that I needed to know about how to get along in the sector and survive in the sector and get as much from it as I was putting in. So we're very proud to be here. And we're also proud that the way in which you stood by us and helped inform the guidance enabled us to include material and scenarios that can really speak to volunteers and volunteer managers. So that's what we'd like to do today. We'd like to share how and why we created the guidance, and to do so, we'll provide some context that I'm sure you and your volunteers will be really familiar with. We're going to run through some of the key components of the guidance, including the potential and responsibilities of public organisations, which you were referring to just as we started. And we'd also, we've specifically left time at the end so that we can answer some of your questions directly and help you find ways in which you can put this into practice. And I just want to say a little bit of a thank you, Tamsin, as well for mentioning that it's been Trans Awareness Week this week, and the really quite moving day that yesterday was for Trans Remembrance Day. It was a day where we recognise loss through violence in the community, but I think that the trans inclusive culture actually gives us stories of hope in the way in which we can move forward. So from yesterday to today, here we are. So I'll hand over now. Rich, I think you're up next to give us some context.
Yeah, thanks EJ, and thanks everyone again for having us here. It's really great to be invited along. So I just wanted to say something briefly about the context within which we develop the guidance. The research centre typically takes its time on research projects. We can take months and years to get the right team, hone our research questions, gather funding, and work with the right partners, and so on. So typically our projects will unfold over the medium to longer term. With trans-inclusive culture, we worked really at pace, and we announced to the sector that we were going to develop this guidance back in May, and we launched it in September. So the reason for that, if you think about the headlines on the left, the wider picture is the social and political context within which we are all operating, and in which trans people are living. And we know there is a real consensus around the rise in hate crimes across all the 4 nations consistently. So a kind of increasingly hostile and difficult environment for trans people and for trans inclusion. If we then turn also to our sector, the heritage and museum sector, this had been building for a while, but no sooner had we announced that we were doing this work, it seemed that every week we would open the news and find different controversies related to trans inclusion playing out, sometimes in quite public ways. So the V&A was in the news, but in July, many of you will have seen that issue around the young V&A. Also, we were being approached in less public ways behind the scenes. So this did end up in the Museum's Journal around the People's History Museum, but the People's History Museum and a good number of other museums were reaching out to the research centre, talking about the challenges they were facing and some of the unfolding challenges they were dealing with, and looking for that guidance. So we decided to work quickly and tell you a little bit more about the process that we use. But that was that context and why we wanted to act quickly and launch the guidance when we did. Suzanne.
Okay, so we can have the next slide, Richard. So hi, everybody. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the guidance, and particularly about the 2 areas that it brings together around the law and also ethics. So the guidance explains key components of the UK law, as well as some of the limitations and complexities of the law. And you'll be able to read this afterwards, but we just want to share some of that with you as a sort of starting point for engaging with it. So under the 2010 Equality Act, which includes a public sector equality duty, and you can see that here on the slide, public sector cultural organisations in the UK, and that includes private organisations and charities if they are carrying out a public service or if they're publicly funded, already have a legal responsibility to eliminate discrimination, advance equality of opportunity for those with protected characteristics, and foster good relations between those who share protected characteristics and those who don't. Quite interesting, isn't it, to sort of see it set out in that way? It focuses the mind. This can feel very complex in relation to trans inclusion. So recent case law has meant that gender critical beliefs, so broadly speaking, the belief that sex is biologically determined, binary and immutable, alongside other beliefs, are now protected under the Equality Act. And of course, we live in a free country still. We have the right to believe what we want to believe, but of course, how we manifest our beliefs matters. And so we can't simply, unthinkingly, manifest our beliefs in the world and cause harm to others. How we manifest our beliefs matters. So the change in the Equality Act has generated this sense of unease. It's generated uncertainties and challenges for those striving to create and maintain organisational cultures and environments that are inclusive and safe for trans people. It's also led to conversations and confrontations, as Richard suggested, that cultural professionals are not always equipped to take part in or resolve. Among other things, the public sector equality duty dictates that management personnel should assess the equalities impact of any policy, process, or decision that's likely to affect people with protected characteristics, and that this should be integral to their decision-making, evaluated with rigour and an open mind. And as Cowan and Munro have noted, and I'll just give you a little quote from them, policies and practices, or lack thereof, that have a disproportionately adverse impact upon particular groups may constitute unlawful discrimination. End of that quote. So compliance with the general equality duty is a legal obligation, and it requires that we think about the most effective way in which all protected characteristic groups can generally be included in any service or activities offered. It allows cultural organisations to be proactive in publicly promoting trans-inclusive environments, and indeed organisations such as museums that are not trans-inclusive could be discriminating against individual staff and visitors. Importantly, creating a trans-inclusive organisation, so for example by adopting trans-inclusive policies and guidance that cover harassment and bullying against trans people, does not conflict with equality duties to prevent discrimination against or foster inclusiveness for any other protected characteristic group. So the shorthand there is it's not discriminatory to undertake this work. And yet few cultural organisations have undertaken meaningful steps to advance trans inclusion. But what we know from doing this project is that many cultural organisations have said that they want to do more. So if we could have the next slide, please. So recognising that the law can't provide all the answers and that we also need other perspectives and forms of knowledge to drive this work, the guidance also includes an ethical framework informed by leading edge scholarship and practice around museum ethics and inclusion. And it sets out a series of principles and actions that you can take forward. And what you can see on this slide is how that's organised. It's organised under these 4 questions, and then a section of the ethical framework sits behind each of those 4 questions. So if we just go on to the final slide for this part. So what you can see here is the ethical framework, part of that ethical framework that sits behind that question: how can we generate a trans-inclusive organisational culture? And actually in all aspects of the wider ethical framework, there's content there that will be absolutely of use to you in your work with volunteers. But this part of the framework clearly speaks particularly well to some of the conversations that you've been having today. And we could pull out any number of things here. Actually, it's so rich, the framework. But if we just start to look at some of the elements there, we might go to 2 o'clock and think and look here about by ensuring you partner with, receive funding from, and work with organisations that foster trans-inclusive practice. It's giving you a clue there about working with, partnering with, prioritising trans experiences and voices in the work that you do. If we look next to that, by establishing the ground rules for respectful working and caring relationships within your organisations, what are you doing to ensure that everyone understands what those ground rules are? What does respectful working mean? And clearly there's also a link to that first principle that we introduced about ensuring that you're partnering. So there's relationships between these elements. Just want to pull out a couple more. If we go straight across to 10 o'clock, 9:30, 10 o'clock, by ensuring the organisation's equity and inclusion policies address trans inclusion alongside wider commitments to inclusion. So we might think there about naming, so ensuring that our policies name and are specific about trans inclusion, and that might cover a multitude of policies there, including that policy we mentioned around bullying and harassment. So as you move around the framework, all of these elements are required if you're really seriously going to start to build up this activity. And what's so great about the frameworks is that they're very direct, incredibly practical, and can be applied to your setting.
Okay, I'll jump in here, Suzanne. Thank you. Here's a fun slide, everybody. So I think it's quite important to note how widespread the support has been across the sector, and how grateful we are to our supporting organisations. And I think one of the reasons that it's important to acknowledge this widespread support is that it helps dispel the myth often portrayed in the media that trans inclusion is not a widely shared value across British society. Actually, here you see all the organisations that want to come together and stand tall and be proud and say, this is what we do, and this is how we operate, and these are our values, and here's some practical guidance that we support to help you do it too. You know, we always say there's strength in numbers. This is a pretty good slide to prove that, I think. Inclusivity is really a core part of our everyday work as ethical and inclusive organisations. It's not an individual agenda or a divisive ideology. And I think standing together, collectively well informed, helps us with our confidence to cut through the din of the culture wars. We're not here on our own doing this by ourselves, siloed. This isn't something that's only being driven by members of the community. Remember, members of the community also have families, they also have friends, they also live in their communities that they're accepted. This is wide-reaching, far-reaching sort of positionality that says, listen, this affects so many of us. Let's stand together and speak up together and do it in this really, really well-informed way. So again, just want to come back to say thanks and how grateful we are to the Heritage Voluntary Group for stepping up early on and declaring your support and interest. If we go to the next slide, please, Richard, thank you. So we launched the guidance at the Bishopsgate Institute on the 7th of September. It felt like the right space to do it because that's actually where the Museum of Transology's collection lives. There's more than 1,000 objects. You can see a big pile. We got out Placard Mountain for the day and had a look at some of the community voices that were embedded in the objects there. It was all very fun. And the Bishopsgate was absolutely packed. People travelled from everywhere to come along and show their support on the day. It was released free to download on the same afternoon, and over 5,000 people accessed the guidance in a meaningful way. So this isn't just merely that they had a quick peek and went off. This isn't impressions. This is who actually engaged with the guidance within the first month. So that is a huge response from our sector. And in an online survey of more than 1,000 respondents, it became clear to us that the majority of the downloads were from cultural practitioners and that they had made it clear that they were using the guidance to advance trans inclusion in their organisations. So just rounding up those two slides, this has received widespread support from the professional side, from within organisations, from practitioners. So really pleased to see that we're now thinking about how volunteers can engage with the guidance, because, you know, they're at the cold face of the heritage sector, front-facing edge of it. And so hopefully this will really improve confidence. And like I say, we'll spend some time going through some questions at the end to see how we can make it more directly accessible for you.
Thanks, EJ. Thanks, Suzanne. I'm just going to finish on, I think this is the last slide before we open up for your thoughts and questions. And just include these to equip everyone on the call who wants to take this work forward to, we've talked about the hostile environment for trans people. We've talked about the uncertainties that cultural practitioners and leaders face. So we kind of went into this, I guess, with our eyes open, and we had all sorts of media coverage which we anticipated. So really inflammatory and misleading articles like the one on the left with Spiked Online. Trans activists have taken over our museums, and these we took a decision early on not to engage with these. There was a piece on we were invited to go on DB News and speak to Jacob Rees-Mogg, so we politely declined that invitation. We didn't respond to some of the other predictably inflammatory, misleading articles which we had prepared for. However, Arts Professional ran a piece which was actually an opinion piece. The article is the headline in the middle. It's hard to see that it's an opinion piece. In fact, it reads like a piece of journalism that straightforwardly tells the reader that the guidance is high risk. And we took a decision at that point that we needed to correct what was very misleading, factually incorrect reporting there. So we published our own response to that, which then got picked up again by Arts Professional. There's plenty of room in museums for all of us, and it's not a long read, and if you get a chance, have a look at it. It's on our website. We can put the link in the chat in a moment. It got picked up by a few places, including Arts Professional, but I think it's a really important response that very straightforwardly and level-headedly deals with the misleading reporting which can happen. And I share it just here because as you take the work forward, you might encounter colleagues, bosses who might have been exposed to this and might repeat with confidence a mantra that it's high risk, and you need to know that it isn't, and that that's a sort of feature of the landscape that we're working in, but it's really watertight, and we set out exactly why in our response to that. So I think I'll stop sharing there and hand back to you, Tamsin. We have one last, there's a QR code at the end that we were going to ask you to have a look at if we have time, so I could put that slide back up. But maybe we pause there and see what questions or comments you have that we could discuss with you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I've got a question just to enable other people to think about other questions, but also remembering that conversation doesn't happen at the end of a conference. Conversations are ongoing and supportive. So thank you so much. What I love about the guidance is it highlights the moral, ethical and legal responsibilities that we all have in terms of creating an inclusive culture. And I love the scenarios that speak in a scalable way across all museum operations and heritage organisations, as opposed to case studies that I often feel as if are spun and are less applicable. So I love it. The conversation I came into and I joined from my previous session was around culture. And I think, Chris, you were saying that it takes a long time to change the culture of a sector or the culture of organisation. And an old adage is that for every 10 years an organisation has been in existence, it takes one full year to change the culture of the organisation. So I say that in terms of enabling people to realise that sometimes this does take time, but it's still a step in the right direction at every step of the way. So not to give up, to be tenacious, to be persistent, to be an advocate, to be an ally, all of those things. So my question to Richard, EJ or Suzanne is, if you were to say to one thing to the audience here today to do as a result of today's session, what would it be? So what one thing could they do to advance this within their own organisations and practice?
Who wants to go first? I'm going to just go for an easy one, which would be about sharing with colleagues. I think it is freely available. It's been written in a way, as you generously say, Tamsin, that is intended to be concise, practical, and I would sort of share it upwards and across your organisations, but particularly up to leaders who have opportunities to take this work forward, so that it isn't on us as individuals to do this work, but starts to get socialised as an idea amongst our senior leadership. EJ, Suzanne, do you want to share a suggestion or a takeaway?
Tamsin, I come back. Sorry to jump in, Suzanne. I didn't check with you before I even looked up on my screen. Tamsin, I was just writing down, thinking about this idea of how long it takes to change culture. Actually, I would argue that this isn't a culture change, that we already do this work, and having confidence in declaring that and standing your ground and saying that in the workplace, that we don't stand for homophobia, although you can hold homophobic views. We don't stand for racism, although it's a free democratic society, and if you do hold racist views, that's up to you. It's how we enact and are confident in ensuring that this work is already being done in our organisations. Trans inclusivity isn't different from any other form of inclusivity. So it's not a culture change, it's the values of our organisation to be inclusive. It's the law, and it's who we are as a heritage sector, according to my big fancy lovely slide of lots of logos.
Thank you for that reflection. You're absolutely right. Suzanne, anything else you would like to share with our group before I sort of close off today's session and hand over to Matt, our chair?
No, my mind was going in the same direction as EJ's, actually, about, we're doing another project where we're sort of questioning some of this, the sense in the sector that change takes such a long time, and actually in the health sector as well, even when there's research that shows there are better ways of treating patients, it takes ages, and it's more to do with our sort of lethargy and inability to handle change, really. So I think sort of not positioning it in that way is really clever and important, because it is about, these are the things we say, the values that we say that we adhere to already. I would just add, I suppose, I think what you can do is pick across the guidance, and there are lots of really quick wins in there that can build confidence. So if you go through and you highlight, for example, some of the things that are about adding clauses into policies, thinking about who you're partnering with, training and so on, there's actually quite a lot of them. So I would start there and go for those quick wins, because I think it builds confidence, and then you can carry on from that point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I don't think there are any questions. It doesn't mean that you haven't reflected on anything, but please feel free to ask questions. Either tomorrow we can forward them on, or you can contact these three amazing people in terms of their work. One of the things I would just highlight, just in terms of saying thank you to all three of you for giving up your valuable time, is that we are absolutely committed to inclusion. It's one of our values as part of our new strategic framework and our new strategy. We have a monthly EDI forum, which is a safe space for people to bring the challenges they're experiencing within their own organisations around inclusive practice, and we then act as a hive mind to support and encourage and signpost good practice. We already run 3 workshops around inclusive volunteering, inclusive recruitment, and also measuring change. And then for next year, a new kid on the block is all around creating those changes. So for those of you that have heard me speak before, I love Cotter. Look him up. It's a model of change that enables you to absolutely capitalise on those quick wins, as well as forming alliances and coalitions. And I think that, for me, is the most important aspect of all of our work around inclusive practice, is how can we work together to move things forward. So thank you very much. Oh, Cotter, John Cotter, 8-step model of managing change. Amazing. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm now going to hand back to Matt, our chair of HVG, to close off today. Thank you so much again, Richard, Suzanne and EJ.